So what about actual siege units? Are those used often or at all? Because I hardly see any. I think I saw one trebuchet and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine they aren't used much because they are pretty bad to set up.
Yes. Part of the problem, I think we were talking about this the other day, right? Is that the way multiplayer works is let's say I was to attack someone's city with a siege unit, right?
Yeah.
On my turn, I would, because it's simultaneous turn. So I move my trebuchet into range of their city. They shoot it.
They get one turn to just do as much damage as they want to it.
Yep, and then the start of next turn, if they're really quick, they can shoot my trebuchet before it can even get a shot off. So oftentimes with siege units, your siege unit is dead before it can do anything. And siege units are on a hammer-to-hammer basis. They're weaker than like crossbows, for example. Trebuchet is going to cost the hammers it's going to cost. It's not going to have the same power as a crossbow unless it's shooting a city. So it tends to be a less efficient use of your resources.
Do you ever use them defensively, like here?
What's the benefit of using a trebuchet?
So, for example, right here, what was your logic here behind building a trebuchet instead of another crossbowman? You probably don't remember because it was a year ago.
I don't, honestly. I might have had something pre-built. I might have been thinking about cannons because once you start getting into, I already had a musket tech, right? Because I'm producing Minutemen. I might have been thinking about cannons. I'm not entirely sure why I did that, honestly. I might have been thinking about potentially, do I have a road that's within 2 tiles of his city? Because if you have roads that you can set up and shoot on the same turn, then it's worth something. But I'm not entirely sure, honestly. It's been a while.
So this war at this point is a bit of a stalemate. And as long as you don't lose, then you're kind of in a winning position if someone attacking has to give up after a long stalemate, because he will lose more resources than you.
Yeah, that's the goal. Certainly defending is easier than attacking. You get the benefit of your city being able to shoot, and you get the benefit of your road networks, and you get the benefits of fortifying in your own terrain. So there's some serious benefits to defending. So
at least there's a lot more pressure on the attacker because he has to get something out of the war.
Yep, absolutely. And the longer the war goes on, the less likely, especially if it's clearly stalemating, the less of a reason the attacker has to continue fighting you. Because at some point he has to go, if I keep fighting, I'm going to lose the game. So I need to stop fighting here.
Yeah, especially since like other players see you fighting and they can take advantage of that. But like the Maya player right now in this game.
Yeah, he could, for example, attack me on that side. Although when you do see players, you do see humans in some level.
I'm not even talking about just attacking one of the sides of the conflict, but just seeing that they are fighting each other, so he can focus less on defenses, less on military attacks, and more on just powering ahead.
Absolutely, and that's horrifying when that's happening. It's certainly in the back of my mind this entire game that Maya's just teching away. Move it forward just a little bit, if you will. I think we get to some points where we see some Citadel exchanges. And that's worth talking about a little bit. Yeah, there's some Citadels. Okay, so what happened here is he Citadel me. That Citadel where the impies are fortified in is his Citadel. He placed it first, and I counter Citadel by putting my Citadel here and then he counter Citadel again with the one.
I see 5 Citadels.
Yeah, and this is what's happening. And I'm actually doing a decent job in this particular screen capture here because I still have both of my Citadels. Yeah. Even though they're up against his Citadels, which sucks, but I still have both of them, and that's really important. Because
I also see a lot of forts. Like, how often do you build forts? Because the one thing that can kind of backfire about forts is that while a Citadel, as long as it's in your territory, it works to your advantage, unless it's pillaged. But you can actually use a fort inside someone else's territory for yourself, defensively.
Are you 100% sure about that?
It won't do damage to your unit like the Citadel will.
Yeah, but I don't think it gives defensive bonuses either.
Right, but there's no like downside to standing next to a fort.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, but there's no. But I don't. If my opponent is standing in my fort, he doesn't get the defensive bonus, so he's not getting any. His units aren't harder to kill. So there's no. The downside of forts, as I see it, is forts take up a tile, right? You can't have a farm on the same tile as a fort. That's the downside.
Here you have some forts in actual workable range of your city.
Yep. Yeah, which is unfortunate, but. First and foremost, I have to survive, right? So,
yeah, that's true.
This is a really scary fight because it's 2 players worth of production, and they have 2 really powerful, unique units in here.
And this fight has been going on for a pretty long time now.
Yeah, I went because this is turn 127, and I don't remember what turn the fight started, but this is probably 40. It's probably at least 40 turns of war,
which is a lot on quick speed.
Which is it's huge. The game often ends at probably this game might have ended around 180 maybe. So like. If there's 180 turns and 40 of them or 50 of them are spent in medieval era warfare, that's a lot.
Actually, which turn roughly does the game usually end on, because in single player data you can kind of tell when the game is roughly going to end. On standard speed it's around 300, 350. On Epic it's around 450 or so. What about multiplayer on quick?
It's a little bit variable because there's lots of different ways. Most of the time that a game ends, it's by concede, not by, like, for example, science victory. So it really depends. When one person is so clearly far ahead that there's nothing anybody can do to stop that is often when you're going to see a game end. And sometimes you'll see stuff like an early concede because someone has maybe isolation with lots of mountain cities and has managed to get all the wonders or a lot of the wonders as it's going up, and they're just running away with the game so much that you might think you're not going to be able to catch up to that. But most of the times, you're going to see a concede towards the later eras, not towards the early eras.
So actually, let's talk about conceding a bit, because I imagine you can't just concede at any moment you want. Other players in the game have to agree that you are indeed irrelevant in this game, right? You can't just go and, I'm conceding, you guys have fun. So what is the point of no return, kind of? Let's talk about this situation, for example. If the Shaka player fails to take any of your cities after dedicating so many resources to this war, is that a good moment? Like, should he concede? Will he concede? Will that be accepted?
Sure. So there's two rules that No Quitters has about this. The first is actually conceding. A concede vote is different than an irrelevancy vote. The second one's a relevancy vote.
Okay.
So a concede is you concede to a player. And that means everybody has to pass that before that's accepted. So let's say we all wanted to forfeit to the Mayans right now. Someone would propose a vote, and then everyone would have to say yes to that vote for that game to be over. And that would be over. The second one is an irrelevancy vote. And this is something you asked for to yourself. And this is basically you're saying, I'm irrelevant to the outcome of the game. I would like to be able to leave the game. And that also requires a vote from all the players in the game to say yes to that. The thing is, even when you're losing, you're often not irrelevant to the game. So right now, the Zulu player is actually quite relevant to the game, because if he leaves, the AI takes over for him. And once the AI takes over, I will crush him horribly. Yeah. So if he just leaves the game, it throws off the balance of the game by giving me a bunch of free cities that I would get because he's unable to defend it. So you do get irrelevancy votes. Mostly irrelevancy votes are related to technology, because a player is so far behind in technology that he can't even slow down another player. For example, that might be a good time to ask for irrelevancy. Sometimes two players will ask for it for the same time. So let's say this war dragged out another 100 turns and there was no movement at all. No one had taken any cities. Maybe myself, the English, and the Zulu might all ask for irrelevancy at the same time and get voted out. Because that way we're not giving an advantage to another player who is not part of this, but at the same time we have no chance to win the game.
Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So
one more thing I wanted to mention in the context of this war, because I'm looking at that city-state just to the south at all times. Are city-states relevant in wars like this? Because I realize gold is much harder to get in multiplayer, but if one of you were to get allied with that city-state, that would make a massive difference here.
I actually think I started the fight with ally status with that city-state. It becomes challenging to, yes, city-states do matter, of course. Especially right at the beginning of a war, and especially in the early eras, their units can be quite annoying because they have a lot of those units. The thing is, the city-state is essentially an AI player, and the AI doesn't know how to use units for shit. So,
but still, if these units are behind your lines, they will still harass you.
Yeah, and they can be irritating. They certainly can be irritating. So, I mean, that's one of the things that happens in simultaneous games, which is actually really annoying, is that players can buy a city-state and then declare war on you. So let's say you had an allied city-state on the same turn, and let's say it's a happiness city-state, right? And you're relying on that city-state for happiness. They might buy it out from under you, then instantly declare war. So you don't.
I do that even in single player, just to make sure AI won't buy it back.
Yeah, all right. So they do that a lot, and that can be really, really annoying. So I mean, if you can help it, you try not to rely on city-states for happiness in particular, because if you go to war, let's say you start a war and a player is aggressing you, so they probably have more units than you because they're planning the attack while you're reacting and defending, and they buy out your city-state, so you're at, like, let's say you're -6 unhappiness or -10 unhappiness when you start the war, it can be really devastating.
Yeah.
But mostly if you have a position where, I mean, the AI just isn't very good at war, and city-states are particularly bad at war, it seems like. They don't really tend to try to take out cities, they just tend to harass you a little bit, so it tends to be not such a big deal.
I wanted to go back for a moment to what we said about gold. You are right now at 0 gold and -36 gold per turn. So you are losing 36 science per turn, which is something like 15-20% of your total science output. I know that you're doing this because you can't win if you lose the game, if you get killed. But surely, if this goes on for too long, you will be too far behind. Is that not true?
That's absolutely true. I mean, this is, we call that warring into irrelevancy, or irrelevant wars, right? You don't want to be trapped in an irrelevant war. You don't want to be stuck
I think
in
you're considering building a magic castle here.
Yep. That combat bonus is actually pretty good.
Yeah.
It's one way to stack promotions in multiplayer.
And that's only 4 turns. Like I think that's also another thing that makes a huge difference on quick speed. Because on quick speed, in a game like this, you can kind of build wonders like this reactively. There's no way you can do this on Epic or even Standard, honestly, because that takes too long. If you have to spend 20 turns building a wonder, that's going to be too long.
I had my first ever marathon game recently, and I was blown away by how long that took to do. I'm like, are you kidding me? It was like 30 turns for a compo or something. I'm like,
marathon is pretty bad.
So yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. You can get away with reacting a lot more on quick speed.
Do players actually build wonders reactively often?
Like defensive wonders?
No, just wonders in general, as a reaction to something that's happening in the game.
Tends not to be. Wonders tend to be good enough that most people are proactively going after wonders as opposed to reactively going after wonders. So because they're so cheap, or just because there's no AIs in the game, you see players build a lot of wonders. So
yeah. So I think at this point, this war will have to end soon.
Yes, it will have to.
You are sacrificing so many resources to defend yourself. I imagine the Shaka player is also sacrificing a lot to keep up this attack.
I sincerely hope so, because it's been a long war here. And I mean, when you see me hovering over Himeji Castle, what you're actually seeing me do is make the decision: can I afford not to build units for 4 turns in order to get this? Because if you look, I mean, the city is in low red and has been in low red for probably at this point 20 turns, because I just have to keep taking those tiles over and over and over again to keep.
If he gets a unit there, you lose basically.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, but this is medieval era war. This was I think this shows a little bit about how citadels are used defensively with that, how you use certain types of units. If you look, the Minutemen over here, I'm not doing a lot of attacking with the Minutemen. They mostly fortify into certain positions. When you kill units, you kind of want to complete kill units. It's not all that advantageous to be giving your opponents experience over and over again by feeding them like 1 or 2 attacks here and there. You really want to focus fire a unit and kill it entirely so they can't move it away, they can't run it away, and they can't stack experience.
So one more thing in context of taking cities. Do you often run into the situation where 2 players will just flip a city back and forth between themselves if it's a very exposed, open position? You have huge armies around it. Is that a thing that happens?
Sometimes it makes the city totally worthless, which is it's not always beneficial. I mean, a lot of times it happens, but it's not.
Would it be useful to just flip the city back and forth a few times, then withdraw because that city is worthless to the defending player anyway?
Yeah, you can hurt players that way. Sometimes if you can do that cheaply, it might be worth it, right? A lot of times what you actually see that happen with is you see that happen with frigates, because frigates are mobile fast enough, and they can come in and often surprise a player. And then you just take the city, they take it back, you take it back once more, and suddenly the population's at like, an eighth of what it was, and the city's pretty much ruined.
Yeah, and you just take it with the goal of just hurting that city, not with the goal of keeping it for yourself.
But probably this is true in single player, right? When you go to war, you probably have a pretty specific reason to war, right? Yeah. And that might be conquest. It might be like I'm trying to get more empire than I have by taking other people's empire. Or
sometimes the goal is to hurt the runaway AI. I totally agree.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's similar when you're attacking in these games, if you're going to be doing that or the other way.
So you mentioned frigates. How often is naval warfare a consideration? Because these games are played on Pangea, but if you have a coastal start, I imagine naval warfare can be pretty good, especially as some civs. Or on the flip side, if you see a civ like England in the game, how worried are you about that if you start with a coastal location?
In general, naval warfare has 2 real eras. I mean, you can galleass rush sometimes people occasionally, but it's pretty rare. What you see frigates be warfare that matters. You see a lot of frigate warfare, and then you see battleship warfare in the kind of later game. And also like carriers with nukes are a really big deal. So it's actually, naval is surprisingly important because atomic bombs come so soon in the game relative to nuclear shelters that often having coastal access is the difference between whether you get nuked or not, right? Yeah. So if you have subs out and you can stop the carrier from getting to you, you don't get nuked. But if you don't have no coastal access, they can just, with impunity, roll a carrier up and nuke you.
Yeah,
so
true.
Coast can actually be really important. And as to answer the question about England, ships of the line are so powerful that oftentimes players will actually move off the coast rather than settle the coast just to avoid England's ship of the lines. Because if you know England's in the game, because it's almost impossible to stop ship of the lines. I mean, frigates are hard enough, but ship of the line are ridiculous. So yeah.
So is the carrier and the nuke thing something you would be worried about in a game like this because you never actually started a coastal city here?
Yeah, I'm definitely worried about that. It's a late game consideration, but as the late game gets closer and closer, it becomes something I'm more and more worried about. Absolutely.
Okay, so this is turn 120. Which era are we in right now? Because I wanted to talk a bit about ideologies, because while that is more of a late game thing, I imagine it's still quite relevant in multi. And
ideologies are extremely important.
Is autocracy the premier ideology in multi?
No, actually, if I had to pick them in order, I'd say freedom tends to be maybe favored like 60% of the time, followed by order, followed by autocracy last.
So can you talk about that a bit? Which are like the most valuable tenets in multiplayer?
I'll break it down by ideology. Probably what you see most in freedom is you see food from specialists, so +1 food from specialists. You see 25% great people from freedom, and you see happiness from specialists and longer golden ages as the tier 2 tenet. And those are probably the 3 most important ones in freedom. Occasionally you'll see, as a tier 2 tenet, occasionally you'll see foreign legions. As a tier 1 tenet, occasionally you'll see some more of the happiness tenets, like the happiness from national wonders or happiness, whatever the other freedom happiness tenets are. But mostly that's what you're going to see from freedom. From
I
order,
think you mentioned when we talk off camera that early adopter tenets are very competed for.
Yes, yes, very much so. Because there isn't a lot of tourism in multiplayer games. It just doesn't happen very much. And most of the time when you're picking ideologies, there's no real downside to picking an ideology that other players don't have. And the upside is you get free social policies, and social policies are very, very strong. And especially with like Order has science from factories. That's a very, very powerful one from Order. And Freedom, has the happiness ones and longer golden ages. And those are essentially free policies for the first person to get it, but they're not free policies for the second person to get it. So it becomes quite competitive, the timing on entering the first ideology. Autocracy, not chosen as much, but it's still chosen. You tend to, the gold purchasing strategy with autocracy can be fairly strong, but it has to be a pretty specific scenario where you have a lot of gold per turn. And then getting those military bonuses off autocracy is good, but autocracy doesn't have a way to go to space, whereas both freedom and order do. So if you're not sure that the game is going to end by military, it might actually end in a space race. If you're autocracy, you have a pretty significant disadvantage when you're trying to do space race.
But I imagine if you yourself are going for a domination victory, then it's a pretty good ideology, right?
It can be. If you can keep the science up. I mean, the other thing is freedom has science in it, basically, because you get more food out of it. Order has direct science in it from factories, but autocracy has no science in it. And although the spy stealing tenet is a decent one, it's pretty unreliable and it's unpredictable whether or not you'll actually get the ones you need when you need it.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, let's talk a bit about stealing techs.
Okay.
How does that even work in multiplayer? Because, I mean, now you can just build constabularies, police stations everywhere to try to kill other people's spies, but really, how often do people dedicate production to that?
Well, actually, constabularies and police stations don't help the percentage of killing spies. All they do is slow down how quickly spies steal. There's only one thing in the game that actually increases the rate at which, well, 2 things in the game that increase the rate at which spies are killed. The first is leveling spies up, and that's actually not that good a bonus. It's only 4% extra per. It starts at, I think 30, and it goes up to like about 40, maybe 42 or something. And then there's a tier 1 order tenet that gives you double spy killing, double percentage on spy killing. It's actually really hard to stop other players' spies. Most of the times you're spying capitals because it takes too long. One of the things that's, so this was actually an interesting question that had come up recently with some of my viewers. One of the things is that the quick speed modifier is harsher on spies than it is in the other versions. So your spies take proportionally longer to steal in quick speed than they do in standard speed. So spies are actually better on standard speed than they are in quick speed. Just because of the way the modifiers work out for that.
So in general, how do you actually use your spies once you get to the point of having, let's say, 3 or 4 slightly later into the game? Would you consider using most of them for counter espionage? Do you try to steal techs, or what do you do with them?
In the very late game, spies are basically all about vision. They're about vision for using stealth bombers and using XCOM. So in the very late game, mostly my spies are just in positions where I want to see as many of the cities of the player I'm attacking as possible.
And what about mid-game? I see you're spying on the Mayan player here to probably try stealing techs and see what he's doing in his capital.
It depends on where I am in the tech order. If I'm high in the tech order, I'm probably going to be counter-spying, putting spies in my capital to try to prevent them from stealing. If I'm low in the tech order, I will probably be, especially if I've been in a long time of war like this, I'm going to try to be catching up by getting as many spy steals as I can. One of the tricks you can do with spies is time them, right? Because the way that spy stealing works is that the length of time that it takes for your spy to steal is based on the most expensive tech that the opponent has that you don't have. And that means if, for example, the opponent has sailing, and you don't have sailing,
right?
But you have all the other techs. What you can do is you can put your spy in his capital. Once it calculates a time at like 4 turns or something, or 6 turns, or whatever it's going to be to steal the tech as cheaply as sailing. You can then text sailing, and then the next tech that they have that you don't have is going to be something like radio or something.
Yeah,
right?
Much more expensive.
Right, and then you can manipulate spy timing to actually get some fairly cheap steals of very important technologies. But the problem is it's hard to do that. It requires a pretty good look at what their tech is and what your tech is. It requires pretty intense timing, and you're still at the mercy of RNG, right? You're still at the mercy of whether or not your spies die. So it makes autocracy a lot less of a sure thing in getting science, because it's very hard to actually make spy stealing work 100% of the time.
And since we mentioned wonders a bit and ideologies, is ideology pressure something people try to use at all in multi, or is that just too big of a production investment to bother with? Because the happiness penalties from ideology pressure can be really harsh.
Yes, I should have. I guess I didn't ever finish that. I talked about freedom. I talked about order. I never talked about autocracy.
Yeah, you can continue about that.
Well, I think they're related, is why I bring it up. Because one of the tenets in autocracy that players actually do use from time to time is futurism. And this is one of the few times that you ever see people use ideology pressure. That and when you pass word ideology, that one tends to happen quite a lot in multiplayer games. So the World Congress word ideology tends to be something where people will use that to pressure people.
Right.
But in general, futurism is one of the few ways you can reliably get happiness pressure on players using tourism in multiplayer. And it's just because, again, it's not scaled for game speed. So it's 250 tourism on a quick speed in the same way. Right. So it becomes an actual way that you can impact people's happiness.
Yeah, that's actually much better on quick speed when I think about it.
Yeah, a lot better. Yep, for sure. Still not enough to win you a tourism victory, although you can sometimes try it versus players who don't generate a lot of culture. Can sometimes do it, but it can be a way to irritate your opponents by forcing them. Do you even see
tourism victories in multi?
Very, very rarely. They're very difficult to do because culture is directly related to science. The more culture you get, the faster you get it, the sooner you fill out rationalism. Culture and culture wonders tend to be very highly prioritized. So you don't tend to see people being able to get enough tourism fast enough. And the other thing is that the tourism types, to win tourism, to actually have a decent tourism, requires a lot of technologies that aren't particularly good at science and aren't particularly good at war. So it's really hard to time tourism to not get killed while you're doing it.
Not to mention, like, one of the ways to finish off a culture victory is to tourism bomb a player, but it's not like a human player will just let you do that. He will do his best to defend himself against that. I
had a game one time, Marbozir, where I was trying to do that to a player, and the player was really far away, and I saved up 3 musicians, and like the player was at war with me, but he had a coastal city, so his city wasn't actually on the coast, but his borders were expanded into the coast, and the plan was to sneak into those borders and do it and try to win. And you know what screwed me? City-state caravel. I'm like, no! It was like info era, and this caravel comes in and starts attacking my musicians. I was so mad.
Anything else? Oh yeah, I have one more topic that we didn't touch on at all, which is World Congress, embargoes, luxury bans, things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's used, if it's used at all?
Sure. The World Congress has a number of powerful policies in it. Generally, what happens in the World Congress with players is players block vote in the World Congress, and they don't always block vote for things that they want. They tend to block vote to block the leader, is what it tends to be. So oftentimes, the person who gets elected to World Congress is the weakest player in the game, the player who's doing the least well, because you don't want to consolidate power, right? You don't want to give the top. You don't want to let the top player have any more power by controlling the World Congress. And turns out that most players don't also want to vote their rivals into power, so they tend to vote the weakest player. The ideologies that get, or the stuff that gets passed the most or proposed the most in multiplayer are World's Fair, World Ideology, World Religion, and cultural heritage sites, the one that gives you 3 culture per wonder. Those tend to be probably the most the ones that are proposed the most. And then occasionally you'll see things like Embargo CS comes up. If you're playing against Germany or you're playing against any of the civs that have very powerful city-state stuff, sometimes Embargo CS comes up quite a lot, and that type of thing. But it's a different policy. Like in single player, it's a lot about getting your things passed and also kind of keeping your the other AIs happy with you. And in multiplayer, it's very much not that. It tends to be about stopping the best player, the players doing the best by hurting them from the World Congress. It's hard to get control of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and since we're still looking at this game, you just took Olondi. So would you say the Shaka player in this game lost as a direct result of dedicating so many resources to the war and not actually taking your city in the end?
Oh yeah, I mean, his cities weren't great, but he had a couple of them. He had a weird start as well. I think he would have been able to make it to the late game, but he definitely lost because I killed him. Right, like that's the direct result. Yeah. So I mean, certainly if he had taken cities, he might have been in a better position. But that war was too expensive. And he didn't win the war, which makes it even worse of a war.
Did you end up having a better production base than him in the end, and that made a difference? It's hard to tell for me.
I'm not entirely sure what happened here because I don't have his perspective. He may have. One of the things that sometimes players will do when you're 2 of you are attacking one player, sometimes players will try to use that as a minimal like resource investment, right? So he might not want to put a lot. He might not have actually put all of his production into military because he was thinking that the English player would carry part of that, right? So